Why study the epistles? So, the epistles are letters that are written to believers. Some are written to individual believers. Some are written to an assembly, a specific assembly, and some were written to be distributed to local assemblies in different towns or cities, as well as be circulated and be read in different assemblies. Epistles, like I mentioned, are letters, and they were written to believers. And the contents of the epistles is very interesting. It's very doctrinal and some practical, depending on the letters themselves. Why we need to study them is because the audience is believers. And as a believer, you would learn so much from the epistles about our faith, about this common salvation. You would learn so much about the experiences of what the believers in those times faced and what is God's will concerning whatever that they faced. For example, the Corinthians faced an issue of sexual immorality, and Paul addressed it and spoke and taught on God's will concerning it. To Timothy, Paul spoke about the last days and how Timothy should be aware of what would happen and how to respond to it. Paul teaches Timothy how to teach and instruct those who are rich or those who have money. Paul teaches Timothy on intelligibility or order as it relates to worshiping in church. He teaches on how do you identify and how do you appoint deacons and elders. So there's a lot that relates to our faith in its practical and its doctrinal sense that the epistles actually delves into. The epistles delve into those matters. And so personally, I would recommend that you study and go through all of the epistles. You may ask which ones are epistles. From the book of Romans in the New Testament all the way through to the book of Jude. Those are letters. Those are written by different leaders to different believers. Those are epistles. From the book of Romans all the way through to the book of Jude. Those are epistles, and I would encourage you to go through them, study them, read them, know them, and apply them in your life today. They are so rich in doctrine. I love how Romans, for example, speaks of justification. It shows how no one is righteous, not even one person. It shows that the Jew who obeys or who follows and practices the Mosaic law is not righteous by virtue of practicing the Mosaic law alone. It shows that the Gentile is not righteous as well, that nobody could do anything to obtain righteousness. And it shows how Abraham, as an example, believed God and that was credited to him as righteousness. And it teaches that righteousness is by grace through faith. Nobody can do anything to obtain righteousness except only by believing in Jesus Christ. And so I do encourage you to study the epistles. Here is how to practically study an epistle. If you are studying specifically Paul's letters, most of Paul's letters have a brief background on the church itself. If, for example, an epistle to the Philippians, it has a brief background on how the church at Philippi was established. So you can go back into the book of Acts, where Paul ministers in Macedonia as part of his missionary journey. If you read the Ephesians, it would be also advisable to go back into the book of Acts to read about the Ephesian church and how it was established, how and who and when and how was the church established, and how the gospel was preached there. That gives a solid background on the history of the church. And so many materials also go on to explain the background as to the cultural and historical context of the actual church in that particular town or city or province or country, whatever the case may be. And so it's important to actually get the cultural and historical context as it relates to that particular church, for you to be able to understand the Corinthians, Paul's letters to the Corinthians. You need to understand the context and the history. Understand that it was the Corinthians who actually wrote to Paul asking him questions. Then Paul, in his letters, was then answering the Corinthians. So it's necessary to understand the historical and cultural context. Who were the Corinthians? Where were they from? What were their beliefs? What was their culture? All of that is very necessary for you to understand, in order for you to grasp why Paul had to write what he wrote. Understand that the Ephesians lived in a context where idol worship was a thing. Understand that the Colossians lived in a context where pluralism, the phenomenon of worshiping multiple entities as God and mixing it up as one was a thing of that day. So that's why Paul then had to speak about the supremacy of Jesus Christ and speak about how Jesus alone is enough. So understanding that context is very much important when we study the letters, and when we study the letters. So Paul's letters are quite unique in the sense that some of them do have the brief history of how the church, the particular church whom Paul is writing to, was established, and we find that in the book of Acts. So if there is an instance where a church is mentioned in the book of Acts as part of Paul's missionary journey, then it is advisable to then read concurrently or simultaneously both the history of the church in Acts as well as the actual letter itself. So that's how we study Paul's letters. Peter wrote also epistles, two epistles. James also wrote. James is very much practical in its approach. Jude also, and then there's also epistles written to particular individuals like Philemon, like Titus, like Timothy, both 1st and 2nd Timothy. So it's advisable as a believer to grasp and study and know very well the letters that were written to believers. It's very much important, and I do encourage you, spend some time. It is possible to read all of the epistles, all of the letters, to read them, grasp them, know them, and apply them in your life. May God richly bless you. May God empower you and give you the strength to love and cherish and seek after Him by studying and delving deep into the scriptures. Shalom, family.